Hello and welcome everyone to our weekly session titled Latest in Bitcoin Tech, where we go through the weekly Bitcoin Optech newsletter. And this week we will be covering newsletter number 314, published on 2nd of August 2024. We will go through the preface first. The newsletter is bifurcated into a news section, which this week we have three news articles that we will cover: a release and release candidate, this is one, and five or six code and documentation updates. We'll see how much of it can we cover. All right, so the first one has to do, I'll go through the preface as every week. This week's newsletter announces the disclosure of two vulnerabilities affecting older versions of Bitcoin Core and summarizes the proposed approach to optimizing minor transaction selection when cluster mempool is in use. Also included are our regular sections announcing new releases and release candidates and describing notable changes to popular Bitcoin infrastructure. So the first article is pertaining to vulnerabilities that were recently disclosed in versions of Bitcoin Core that have now surpassed E of life. That is, these versions are not being maintained anymore. In the preceding sessions, we've covered about how Bitcoin Core or a group of Bitcoin Core developers came together and they decided that they need to draft a standard operating procedure to to bifurcate vulnerabilities that are detected in Bitcoin Core's code base and the grounds and the basis on which they will be bifurcated into low severity and medium severity and high severity, and how and on what grounds will they be announced and released to the public depending on how severe the need for disclosure is. And we covered in one of the preceding sessions 10 vulnerabilities that were disclosed. Now, this week has two more vulnerabilities that have been disclosed. Not a lot has been shared about them in detail, so let's see what we can make of it. The first one is disclosure of vulnerabilities affecting Bitcoin Core versions 22.0. Nicholas Gerger posted to the Bitcoin Dev mailing list a link to announcements of two vulnerabilities affecting versions of Bitcoin Core that have been past their end of life since at least October 2022. This follows the previous disclosure last month of older vulnerabilities. See newsletter number 310. We summarize the disclosure below. Before moving further, would anybody like to take a shot as to why vulnerabilities are not immediately disclosed? So if it could be any client implementation, it could be any software. If a software vulnerability is detected, it is almost always the case that those vulnerabilities are not dispersed out in public. Rather, they are confidential and they are disclosed at a certain point in time. There is a certain standard operating procedure that needs to be abided by to reveal those vulnerabilities out to the public. And we've discussed the reason previously. So would anybody like to take a shot at why this is the reason?
One thing I can recall that we discussed before is not whenever the new upgrade, whenever the like any software happens, not every minor updates it immediately. So they wait for a sufficient amount of nodes to completely update their system. Then and then only the whatever the security vulnerability will be there will be got disclosed to the general public.
This is Dhruvel. Was it Dhruvel, right?
Yes, yes.
And Coding P has also said something attackers can exploit them. Yes, correct. Both of you. Yes, because if that vulnerability is revealed out, then obviously it cannot be filtered out from the attackers. And if a malicious attacker gets to know that a software has a vulnerability, then they will exploit it. And that is why generally these vulnerabilities are mitigated and like only after there is no threat of them being malicious anymore or causing a damage anymore are these vulnerabilities disclosed. So yeah, both of you are correct. We'll take a look at both of these vulnerabilities that were disclosed recently and that affect versions of Bitcoin Core preceding 22.0. The first is remote crash by sending excessive adder messages because Bitcoin Core 22.0 released before Bitcoin 22.0. released September 2021. A node that was told about more than 2 to the power 32 other possible nodes would crash due to exhaustion of a 32-bit counter. This could be accomplished by an attacker sending a large number of P2P added messages, at least 4 million messages. Eugene Siegel responsibly disclosed the vulnerability and a fix was included in Bitcoin Core 22.0. See newsletter 159 for our summary of the fix, which was written without us knowing that it patched a vulnerability. So apparently there's a counter, okay, that keeps a track of the addresses that a node is receiving from its peers. Okay, so when a peer bootstraps, when a peer is spun up, it has no addresses in it. It fetches these addresses from its peers, and there are multiple mechanisms to which a bootstrapping node can fetch addresses from its peers. Okay, so one of the ways is that it sends a get adder message to its peers, and then its peers sends the node this message in reply, add the message. Okay, so its peer sends it the messages that it is aware of. Now there's a counter apparently that keeps a track of how many messages are being received. Okay, so if my node sends a get add a message to Alice's node and Alice's node replies with add a message, Alice's node will send my node addresses that it's aware of. Okay, and there's a counter that keeps a track of how many messages my node is receiving, and that counter can have an upper threshold of 2 to the power 32, which is, I believe, 4 million. Okay. Now, there was no limit basically. There was no limit. There was no upper bound to the number of addresses that one node can send to another node. And that is why what a malicious actor could do is a malicious actor could flood the receiving node with dummy addresses, okay, that surpass this threshold and thereby crash it. So your node can only process at the most 4 million messages. More than that, your node will crash because it'll run out of data. It'll run out of data that it can keep track of. So malicious actor basically can send dummy messages to you that surpass the upper threshold, which could lead to a crash. So this is what the vulnerability was, and it was fixed. Let us see what did they say about it in newsletter 159. They discussed this previously as well. All right, they discussed this previously as well. But I think at that point in time they weren't aware that it was a vulnerability. They probably made this change as an optimization, as an upgrade of some sort, not knowing that it is a vulnerability. So it says that this PR limits the average number of announced addresses it will process from each peer to 1 per 10 seconds. Any addresses in excess of the limit will be ignored. It's possible to whitelist peers to allow them to exceed this limit, and any address announcements to the node explicitly requests from its peers are also excluded from the limit. The limit is estimated to be about 4 times higher than the current rate at which a Bitcoin Core node announces addresses. So there's a limit now in Bitcoin Core to the amount of messages that one node can send to another node, and that is one address per 10 seconds. Okay, if I'm not wrong, it will process from each peer one per 10 seconds. Yeah, one address per 10 seconds. Any addresses in excess of the limit will be ignored. Okay, so only one address will be processed. Your counter will only take into consideration and process one address that is sent by each peer per 10 seconds. It's possible to whitelist peers, all right? So if you are certain that there are some peers on the network which are not malicious, for instance, nodes being run by people you personally know, or nodes being run by people that have a higher reputation, and you are certain that they will not attack you, then you can you can whitelist those nodes and you can bypass this threshold that's been set. Okay, so this is the default value, but there are edge cases where you might bypass when you're sure that the node that you have whitelisted will not attack you. And any address announcements to the node explicitly requests from its peers are also excluded from the limit. So any specific address announcements that you have initiated, that you have requested certain specific addresses, even they are circumvented by this threshold. Okay, so broadly what this vulnerability was, that is that your node maintains a counter that keeps a track of the addresses that it is receiving per peer. It has an upper bound of 2 to the power 32, and if a malicious peer exploits it, they can send over 4 million messages to your node, and thereby your node will run out of data to process these messages, and your node will crash. And to mitigate this, they've set up a limit of 10 seconds. So your node will only process one address sent per peer every 10 seconds. Okay, and there are edge cases. We discussed those edge cases. Let us see if we can find something in the PR that makes sense to us. Yes, this. All right. So max add rate per second is 0.1. Okay. So 0.1, this is per second. Okay. 0.1 per second. So it can process 0.1 addresses per second. It means it can process one address per 10 seconds. Okay. So this is the upper bound now that has been changed. Not now, it was changed some time ago. Some time ago. It was changed in 2021. All right. So that is what the first vulnerability was.
Can I add something to that?
Please. Who's that?
Uh,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So this one is like the PR you showed. It's in like it got merged in version 22. Okay, version 22 of Bitcoin Core.
All
So the
right.
whole problem was the 32-bit counter, right? Like it
Right.
should overflow a 32-bit counter. So what's like the
Right.
most obvious fix to patch it? Like if the addresses are overflowing a 32-bit counter, the most obvious fix is to make it 64-bit. Like that's the simplest, most straightforward fix. But the devs didn't do that. Any reason why? Like, can you think of a reason why?
The reason would be like for now, let's say it's 2 to the power 32. All right. So your node can process 4 million addresses per second, like the counter.
Yeah.
Okay. But there is no practical use case in which any node would want to send you addresses that are as many as like 2 to the power 64, right? Like how many addresses can a node send you? How many nodes do we even have in the network? Like 100,000. So why would we want to have a counter of 2 to the power 64 when we have like 100,000 nodes and 100,000 addresses that can be sent at the most, right?
Yes.
That's
Yeah. Yeah, that's also one reason. And another, like, but just making the counter from 32-bit to 64 bits would prevent that crash from happening. This is kind of like like even just the fix which this PR does is kind of like a good fix in the way that it rate limits the peer interactions. But one very straightforward solution would be just making the 32-bit counter to 64-bit counter, and then the crash doesn't happen.
right. Right. Got it.
Yeah. So,
Right. Yeah.
like, if the devs had done that, it would have been very obvious to people that this is the bug they're trying to fix. Like, it's very obvious that 32 bits have been increased to 64 bits. So, this PR is kind of really cool in the way how they're like not even leaking what the actual vulnerability is. They've
Right. Now I got your point. Right. Right. It's like fixing the issue without while keeping the problem confidential.
yeah, that's so clever.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Got it. Right.
How does the problem remain confidential in this approach?
So if I shared a link about the Bitcoin network stats. So if you look at it, you can see like the percentage of like how many Bitcoin Core nodes in the network have are which percent. Like you can see that version 27 is the latest version, and and it has only 21.63 plus 21.63 percentage of the nodes on the network are only on the very latest version of Core. So if I had made it like really, so supposing in the next version of Core I shipped, it will take time for the entire network to upgrade their nodes. So if someone looks at the commit history of Core and sees this, they will know this is an attack they can do, and they would just pull this attack off. And we need to give time for the entire network to upgrade their nodes. So that's when we need to wait a few releases before we disclose these vulnerabilities. Otherwise, attackers would, like anyone can attack. Does that make sense?
That makes sense as to why you don't disclose the vulnerability. But I do not understand like why does not going from 32-bit to 64-bit obfuscate this vulnerability from other people who are looking at the code change. That I did not.
Like if I just have a one-line code change saying it's made from 32-bit to 64-bit, all developers will know it's an overflow attack, and that's if I want to attack Bitcoin or someone running an old version of Node, I would also do it because I know it's a vulnerability.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a PR open in Bitcoin Core to make the 32 bits to 64 bits currently, because it's been a few versions, right? Like, and this attack has already been disclosed, so it doesn't make. It makes sense to now make the 32-bit counter 64-bit counter, even though that would never happen now because of the PR which rate limits the addresses.
All right. Yes. Cool. Thanks, Stratus, for. Let's move on to the next one. The second one is remote crash on local network when UPnp enabled. So before Bitcoin Core 22.0, nodes that enable UPnp for automatically configuring NAT Traversal disabled by default due to previous vulnerabilities. See newsletter 310 were vulnerable to a malicious device on the local network repeatedly sending variants of a UPnp message. Each message could result in the allocation of additional memory until the node crashed or was terminated by the operating system. An infinite loop bug in Bitcoin Core's dependency mini UPnpc was reported to the mini UPnpc project by Ronald Huveniers and Michael Ford, discovering and responsibly disclosing how it could be used to crash Bitcoin Core. A fix was included in Bitcoin Core 22.0. Additional vulnerabilities affecting later versions of Bitcoin Core are expected to be disclosed in a few weeks. So this vulnerability is not directly it's not a vulnerability that is from Bitcoin Core or in Bitcoin Core, but it's rather in a library or a dependency that Bitcoin Core uses. It's called mini UPnpc. Okay, so UPnp is basically universal plug and play. Okay, what universal plug and play does is that uh, it allows multiple devices accessing the same network to communicate with each other. Okay, so like for instance, if you have a Wi-Fi, okay, and you have five devices connected to that Wi-Fi, those devices can communicate with each other. So for instance, if you have a printer that's connected to a Wi-Fi and you have a computer that's connected to your Wi-Fi, okay, and you give a print command to your computer automatically detects that there is a printer in the vicinity, right? Even though they're not connected with each other through a wire. So that's what UPnP basically does. One of its functions is that it allows communication between devices that are connected to the same local network. In context to Bitcoin, what UPnP does is that it allows port forwarding. So by default, in Bitcoin Core and in most of the Bitcoin clients that I can think of, UPnP is currently disabled by default. So if any of you have run your nodes, okay, and have bootstrapped it recently or remember exactly the process of bootstrapping, when if we talk about Bitcoin Core, then it establishes a connection with 10 outbound peers, eight of which are full relay peers and two of which are block relay peers. But it does not establish connection with any of the inbound peers. By default, your access, like other peers on the network, are not allowed to listen to your node. Okay, that is disabled. You have to enable it manually. You have to enable you probably have to go to your router, not probably you have to go to your router and you have to enable port forwarding. So what Bitcoin Core currently does is that it only allows outbound connections by default, 10 of them. And for inbound connections, you have to enable port routing. And UPnP, that is what does. So this library facilitates that. It allows other nodes to listen to your node. So it allows inbound connections basically. This is what this library does. Mini UPnpc, and this is disabled by default. What is NAT Traversal? NAT Traversal basically converts your private IP into public IP. So all devices that you use have two IP addresses. One is a private IP address, which is for the local network, and the other is the public IP address, which is for the internet as a whole. So if you have a local network, right, if you have a port on which you're running Wi-Fi in a local network, and let's say you have your TV connected to that Wi-Fi, smart TV or whatever, and you have your mobile phone and your printer, whatever, right? So these devices that are connected to one network or one Wi-Fi have a specific private IP address, which is only accessible to devices that are connected to that network. So if those devices want to connect with each other or communicate with each other, which are connected to the same local network, they have a private IP address which is not accessible to anybody that is outside that network. Okay, so what NAT basically does is that it converts private IP addresses to public IP addresses. So if anybody from outside your local network wants to communicate with devices that are in your local network, you obviously cannot share your private IP address. So what NAT does is that it converts that private IP address to a public IP address. Okay, so if your node basically has a private IP address which is specific to its local network. Now, if another node which is outside your local network's dominion, which could be anywhere on the internet, wants to establish a connection with your node, okay, the private IP address of your node has to be converted into public IP address to be shared with that other external device that is trying to establish connection with your node. That is what NAT does. It converts basically your device's private IP address into public IP address for the internet, and any requests that are coming from the public IP addresses, it converts it into the private IP address and renders it further to your local device. So the gist and the technical intricacies of this vulnerability are neither mentioned here nor have they given any links that we can refer to, because I believe this vulnerability is not directly a part of Bitcoin Core, but rather it was in this UPnp message. So what was possible is that uh, they were vulnerable. What was vulnerable to a malicious device on the local network repeatedly sending variants of a UPnp message. So a malicious device, okay, on your local network could send multiple or flood your device with UPnp messages, like different variants of UPnp messages, and crash your device. So your device also has a data, like your node has an amount of data that it can process, and if it's asked to process more data than that, then it crashes. So a malicious device could be configured on your local network to send multiple variants of UPnP messages, okay, to your node, which would lead to your node crashing. The entire technical intricacies are not covered here, neither were they covered in the podcast. So I personally am not aware of it. But the point being, we understand what UPnP is, we understand what NAT is, we understand on a surface level what this attack is. Okay, and how it is mitigated. It is mitigated by keeping UPnP off by default. So currently, Bitcoin Core keeps it off by default. So if you ever happen to run a node on your own recently, okay. In fact, most people, if you stick to default configurations, which I believe 99% of the node runners do, most people who run their nodes don't go to the bitcoin.config file and use change the default parameters and use custom configurations. Very few people do that. Most people, they just they download a client and they just start running it. So even if you're running it right now, if you're running a GUI, a graphical user interface of Bitcoin Core, you can go there and in the network section, I believe you'll see that you have a connection established with 8 outbound peers, which are full relay, and 2 outbound peers, which are block relay. And you will not have any inbound connections, which means your UPnP is disabled by default, which means that your IP address is not being shared by anybody on the internet for people to establish connection with you. All right. So this is what that vulnerability was, and it was mitigated, or it is mitigated by keeping UPnP disabled by default in Bitcoin Core, at least the latest version. I don't know when onwards they start doing that, because it was enabled initially, they disabled it. So I believe after 22.0 they disabled it in all the versions. Right. These were the two vulnerabilities that were disclosed lately. If any questions or any thoughts pertaining them, please feel free to go ahead. And after that, we can proceed to the next news article.
Just one point tangential to what you said about block relay with outbound peers, is it? What was the technical term that you used?
Yes, block relay peers. They only relay blocks to you, not each transactions, not individual transactions, neither IP addresses.
Right, correct. And they are only the outbound peers that do that, is it?
Yes.
Okay, okay, got it. Thanks.
Right. Okay, this one has to do with cluster mempool. It's become a ritual post now. Since the past 3 weeks, every week we have something or the other to do with cluster mempool. Let's go through this. It's pretty long. Let's try and break it into pieces and then cover it. So I'll read the first third of it, and then we'll try and cover it, and then the second third in the third half, and then we'll finish it that way. Optimizing block building with cluster mempool. Peter Wooler posted to Delving Bitcoin about ensuring that miner block templates can include the best set of transactions when using cluster mempool. In the design for cluster mempool, clusters or related transactions are divided into an ordered list of chunks, with each chunk obeying two constraints. If any transactions within the chunk depend on other unconfirmed transactions, those other transactions must either be a part of that chunk or appear in a chunk earlier in the ordered list of chunks. Each chunk must have an equal or a higher fee rate than the chunks that come after it in the ordered list. This allows every chunk from every cluster in the mempool to be placed into a single list in fee rate order, highest fee rate to lowest fee rate. Given a chunk mempool in fee rate order, a miner can construct a block template by simply iterating over each chunk and including it in their template until they reach a chunk that will not fit their desired maximum block weight, which is usually a bit below the 1 million virtual byte limit to leave room for the minus Coinbase transaction. Let's try and cover this much first. So firstly, most of you guys are regular, okay, and we have talked a lot about cluster mempool. So I want somebody in brief to tell me what is cluster mempool, like anything, like tell me what's cluster mempool, or tell me what is a chunk, anything, one line, one word, whatever you remember. Or if anybody is not comfortable using the mic, then post something, a definition of what is cluster mempool, something. Let me see. 60 seconds. And Mango, if you type Venmo,
Yeah. So clustering is about like in a mempool, you go about searching the parent and ancestors, so the ancestors and childs of a transaction. If they are all unconfirmed, you sort of cluster them. A subset of a cluster is called as a chunk. That's what I guess. So I can Faisal, you can correct.
right? Anybody else?
It's a replacement for the current way of replacing a transaction through RBF or CPFP. It's a new mechanism in which the mempools will consider the, rather than like individual transactions, it will consider the whole cluster. We'll go back and see where the transaction is also.
Okay, somebody's typing. Let's gather all the answers. Coding P is typing. Yes, Riyan. Want to talk, Shreyan?
Yeah, I think Bala and Setu did cover it. I'd just like to add one point that it is a mechanism, I think, to replace RBF, where the fee rate is decided instead of just summing up all the fees. But I might be wrong that there is some mechanism where fee rate is calculated on the basis of the ancestor transactions of the most recent transaction, and I think there is a limit of 25 ancestors that was included. But yeah, very vague details. So sorry for not being
Right.
precise.
Parts of what you said is correct. Like the how the transactions are currently arranged in the form of ancestors and descendant sets. Yeah. But the fee rate replacement is not in Bitcoin Core. It's in a separate implementation that Peter Todd maintains. Bitcoin Core, to the best of my knowledge, till this day uses both the fee rate and the absolute fee. So one replacement should have not only a higher fee rate but also a higher absolute fee to replace the other transaction.
Right.
Okay.
And how is fee rate determined? Any metric that, I mean, what is the difference between
That's a
absolute?
virtual byte. Okay,
Okay.
so fee rate
Okay.
is, yeah, absolute fee is like the entire amount of fee that a transaction is paying, right? So for instance, if a transaction is of 500 virtual bytes, okay, and you are paying a fee rate of 3 sats per virtual byte, okay, so your fee rate is 3 sats per virtual byte, but your absolute fee is 3 into 500, right? That's
Right.
1500 sats that you're paying. So that is what. So if transaction B wants to replace transaction A, and transaction A is paying a fee rate of 3 sats per virtual byte and an absolute fee of 1500, transaction B will have to pay 4 sats per virtual byte, which makes its fee rate higher than transaction A. But at the same time, it also has to pay a cumulative, an absolute fee of greater than 1500.
Right. Makes sense.
Yeah. So if the second transaction is let's say only 200 virtual bytes, and we pay 4 sats per byte, so our fee rate is higher in this case. Instead of 3, we pay 4. But because the previous transaction was 500 virtual bytes in size, and the current version is 200 virtual bytes in size, so even though our fee rate is high, we only pay 800 sats, so our absolute fee is low. So the transaction needs to have a higher fee rate and a higher absolute fee as well.
And by recent
Okay.
and previous transaction, do you mean ancestor and child transaction? Parent and child?
No, two
Okay.
conflicting transactions. We're talking about RBF here. Two conflicting transactions.
Right. Two conflict transactions. Yes. Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So again, just an overview of how the mempool is looks as of today. Uh, So the transactions in the mempool are arranged in the form of ancestor and descendant sets. Okay. Uh, for a transaction to be included in the mempool, it needs to have a high ancestor set fee rate. So if two transactions are competing to enter the mempool will determine which transaction is paying the highest ancestor set fee rate. Okay, so it will calculate that transaction's fee, its parents' transaction fee, grandparents' transaction fee, all the way up till its ancestors, which are unconfirmed. And if two transactions are competing with each other, then the transaction that is paying the highest ancestor set fee will get included in the mempool. And when you want to kick out a transaction of the mempool, the mechanism is absolutely opposite. You take into consideration the descendant set fee rate. Okay, so if two transactions are in the mempool and you have to kick out one of them for some reason to make way for another transaction, you kick out the transaction that is paying the lowest fee rate. Okay, lowest descendant fee rate. So to include, it's the highest ascendant fee rate, and to kick out, it's the lowest descendant fee rate. And mathematically, it was proven that this mechanism that Bitcoin Core has been using for long is not it's not foolproof, as in it does not replicate accurate results. Okay, so if you are using a certain parameter to determine whether a transaction should enter the mempool or no, you should use the completely opposite parameter to determine whether the transaction should be excluded or not. All right. So the best transaction, if it's included, if this mechanism is giving you the best transaction that should be included, its opposite should give you the worst transaction that is being included that you can kick out. But there were discrepancies. So like this mechanism was not always relishing the best outputs. And that is why this proposal of cluster mempool has been surfacing for quite some time. It completely decides to abolish or intends to abolish the ancestor and descendant fee rates. So a few weeks ago, we went to the policy.cpp file where there are like 4 lines of code, one of which determines how many ancestors are allowed, how many descendants are allowed, and the size of the ancestors allowed and the size of descendants allowed. So no unconfirmed transaction in the mempool can have more than 25 unconfirmed ascendants, including itself, and it cannot have more than 25 unconfirmed descendants, including itself. It cannot have ascendants that weigh more than 101 kilo virtual bytes, and it cannot have descendants that weigh more than 101 kilo virtual bytes. Okay, with cluster mempools, this entire ancestor and descendant anatomy will be abolished. Like transactions will not be included or rejected from the mempool based on merely their ancestry. All right. And then the transactions will be arranged in the form of a data structure, which will be called as cluster. What's a cluster? A cluster is nothing but a set of transactions that are linked with each other. All right. So they could be ancestors, they could be siblings. So all the unconfirmed transactions that are linked to each other in any way, shape, or form is known as a cluster. Let me see if we can find a small definition here to further fine tune. So cluster mempool is a proposal to associate each unconfirmed transaction in the mempool with related transactions, creating a cluster. Okay, so the transactions have to have a relationship with each other. They could be either siblings, they could either be a parent-child or a grandparent and parent and the transaction itself. All right, so all the transactions we'll look at all the transactions that we have in our mempool. Okay, we're trying to make a block now, right? We're trying to make a block. How do you make a block? You make a block by choosing transactions from your mempool. Okay, so your mempool will arrange transactions in the form of clusters. All transactions that are in any way, shape, or form related to each other will be arranged in a data structure called cluster. Now, from those cluster, you'll further divide that cluster into chunks. Okay, you'll further divide those clusters into chunks. So, what is the reason for doing that? Can anybody like take a blind guess at it? Why do we need chunks, right? We've already created a cluster. We've already arranged transactions that are related to each other, parent, child, siblings, etc. We've put them together, sorted them together in a data structure. Why can't we put the entire cluster in a block? Why do we have to further split the cluster into chunks? Chunk is a subcluster basically. Okay, is somebody typing? Let me see. There are typos as well. No, not typos. Okay. So basically, yeah.
Make it dynamic because like new transactions come all the time, and it would totally disrupt the ordering of the cluster we did before. To account for that, we want to be able to move the fee rate order dynamically with coming transactions.
Right. What you said has to do with linearization. I think we'll talk about that further. And there is, in fact, new PR as well that was merged to linearize. So basically, in a cluster, it's essential that in a cluster we arrange transactions in the form of descending fee rate. Right. The transactions at the top of the cluster pay the highest fee rate, and then as we move towards the bottom of the cluster, the transactions will start paying lower fee rate. But that is referred to as like cluster mempool linearization. It's a separate proposal which is called cluster mempool linearization, which does its own math and arranges the transactions. It iterates over the transactions in a cluster and arranges them in the form of descending fee rate. So that's cluster mempool linearization. The reason for chunks is that the size in a block is limited, right? Your mempool is approximately 300 MB. I mean, you can configure it, but the default size I believe is 300 MB. On my node, it's 300 MB. Okay, and your block size, one block cannot take more than 4 virtual MB of transactions or 400,000 weight units. Okay, so let's say there's a cluster of 200 MB. Like, okay, so there are lots and lots of transactions, unconfirmed transactions that are related to each other, and that entire set of all the transactions that are related to each other is up to 200 MB. You can accommodate it in your mempool, but you cannot accommodate it in your block space because your mempool is of 300 MB, but your block is only of 4 virtual MB. So everything that's in your mempool cannot go into your block all at once. So if there is a cluster which is greater than 4 virtual MB, what do you do in that situation? You can't put the entire cluster in the block. So for that reason, you split the cluster into like small pieces, like further small data structures, which are known as clusters. And these clusters are transactions which completely depend on each other, like which cannot be confirmed without each other. So we take a cluster, which is a set of transactions that are related to each other, and then we further split it into chunks because the block space is finite. So it facilitates putting those chunks of transactions into the block, and these chunks are transactions that depend on each other. Okay, and as for the fee arrangement, then something very interesting that we discussed about last week as well is that uh, like in a cluster, right? Let's say there are transactions that start paying at 10 sats per virtual byte and end at 3 sats per virtual byte. So we created a cluster. The highest fee paying transaction in that cluster is 10 sats per virtual byte, and the lowest fee paying transaction in this cluster is 3 sats per virtual byte, right? So we start arranging transactions. At the top of our cluster is 10 sats, then we come to 9 sats, then 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. Okay, that's when a cluster ends. Okay, now, let's say we have the child transaction paying 10 sats per virtual byte, which is at the top of the cluster, and the parent is paying 3 sats per virtual byte, which is at the bottom of the cluster. Now, the child, which is at the top, cannot be mined until and unless uh, the parent, which is at the bottom, is mined. So, what do we do in such a situation, right? We can't put the child in the block before putting the parent in the block. However, the child is paying a higher fee, so it's on the top of the block, and the parent is paying a lower fee, so it's at the bottom of the cluster. In this situation, what we do is when two transactions are dependent on each other in such a manner that they cannot be mined independently, and the parent, for instance, is paying a low fee, it's at the bottom of the cluster, and the child is paying a higher fee, it is at the top of the cluster. In this situation, we calculate the aggregate fee, like we couple the child and the parent, all right, and then we calculate the fee of that package. So 3 and 10 is 13, all right, divided by 2 is 6.5. So we'll couple the child and the parent, and the average fee that the child and the parent are now paying is 6.5, and we'll put them at the bottom of the cluster. So even though the child is paying 10, it won't be at the top, and even though the parent is paying 3, it won't be at the bottom, because cumulatively they're paying 6.5 and they cannot be mined independently. The child cannot be mined without the parent, so we'll put them at the middle of the cluster. So this is like a feature of cluster mempool linearization, that transactions in a cluster are ideally arranged in the form of descending fee rate. However, if two transactions are paying different fee rates, and the transaction that is at the top of the cluster is dependent on a transaction that is at the bottom of the cluster, we'll pair them, find their cumulative fee rate, and then arrange them in the cluster where they are supposed to be. After that, taking that cumulative fee rate into consideration. Okay, so now talking about, hopefully we know what's cluster mempool, how are the transactions arranged in a cluster mempool depending on their descending fee rate. We know what chunk is now. Okay, and we know how transactions are coupled just in case they are completely dependent on each other for mining, and they pay different fee rates. Okay, So what this article covers is that uh, we discussed that we cannot always put an entire cluster in the block, right? Because the cluster might be very big in size, and your block has a very finite or very scarce a size that it can accommodate. In For that reason, we will split the cluster into small chunks. Okay. Now let's say the one chunk is 1,000 virtual bytes. Okay, and you can uh, uh, 1,000 virtual bytes. Okay, and let's say you can put 4,000 virtual bytes in a block. So let's say you took first chunk which is 1,000 virtual bytes. You took second chunk which is 1,000 virtual bytes. You took third chunk which is 1,000 virtual bytes. Okay. Now you have a fourth chunk which is only 50,000 virtual bytes, or let's say the fourth chunk is 80,000 virtual bytes. Okay. So you have now taken up 380,000 virtual bytes out of 4,000 virtual bytes, and only 20,000 virtual bytes is remaining. Okay. But the next chunk is 50,000 virtual bytes. What are you going to do now? Okay, you have two options. You in fact don't even have two options. You will have to waste that space of 20,000 virtual bytes, right? Because like you have a chunk which is a 50,000 virtual bytes, but the space in your block is only 20,000 virtual bytes, right? We took the first chunk 100, second chunk 100, third chunk 100, 300 gone. We took the fourth chunk, let's say 80, 380 gone. Okay, but we have a space of 4,000. Now we have only 20,000 left. But the next chunk which is eligible to enter the block is of 50,000. So we will have to waste that 20,000 virtual byte space because the next chunk in line cannot be put inside. All right, so we'll end up wasting block space, and that is like not very an ideal situation for miners. Okay, what can you do in situation? Can we skip the next cluster and go on to the next one? All right, can we skip the cluster which is eligible to entering the block and then go to the next one which pays the next highest fee rate? Let's say that's 20,000. Okay, so there are two clusters now waiting, two chunks now waiting, 50,000 and 20,000. We skip the 50,000 one and we directly go to the next one, 20,000. We can't do that. Why? Because it is possible that there is a transaction in the chunk of 50,000. Until and unless that is not mined, the transactions in 20,000 cannot be mined. They are dependent on each other. So in the situation, we can't even skip clusters and go to the skip chunks and go to the next chunk. So what do we do in such a situation? So this proposal kind of mitigates that problem. We'll go through it and then I'll try and summarize it again if like anybody has any questions or doubts. However, clusters and chunks vary in size, with the default upper limit for a cluster in Bitcoin Core expected to be about 100,000 virtual bytes. So this is the default upper limit for a cluster. That means a miner constructing a block template that is targeting 998,000 virtual bytes, which already has 899,001 virtual bytes fit, may encounter a 99,000 virtual byte chunk that doesn't fit in. Okay, so a miner is targeting a chunks of these many bytes. So basically, a miner has space in his block that can take this much of size worth of transactions. Okay, so it already has these many transactions. Okay, and now it comes across a chunk that is this much in size. Okay, which is less than the size available for him. What does the miner do in that situation? Leaving roughly 10% of their block space unused. That miner can simply skip the 99,000 V byte chunk and try to include the next chunk, because the next chunk might include a transaction that depends on the 99,000 V byte chunk. If a miner fails to include a dependent transaction in their block template, any block they produce from that template will be invalid. So what if the miner says that, hey, the next chunk that is eligible, I do not have space for that, so let's skip this and let's go to the next chunk. In that situation, what happens is the chunk that the miner has skipped, what if it has a transaction that depends, that has to be mined first before you can go on to the next chunk. So if you mine an invalid transaction, a transaction for which there is no parent, your entire block is invalid. So that is ruled out. So what do you do in such a situation? To work around this edge case problems, Wooler describes how large chunks can be broken down into smaller subchunks that can be considered for inclusion in the remaining block space based on their fee rates. A subchunk can be created by simply removing the last transaction in any existing chunk or subchunk that has two more transactions. Okay, so we'll not go through the entire proposal because this is just an illustration of what he has proposed. Like he's given numbers so that people can imagine how this a real world scenario. Okay, because we run out of time, so we'll just go through what the mitigation. What's the mitigation? The chunks will be made in such an order that you can reduce the space of the chunk. So if a chunk is so big that it is not entering a block for some reason, a block has 10% space remaining. Okay, 90% of the block is full, 10% of the space is remaining. But the next eligible chunk to get into the block is greater than this 10% space. We will find the least fee paying transactions from that chunk and kick it out. So we'll kind of trim the chunk from the bottom. Okay, the chunk is arranged in the order of high fee paying rate transactions. The highest fee paying transaction at the top, and the lowest is at the bottom. So we start trimming the chunk from the bottom. Okay, and make sub chunks till we reach a level where that chunk becomes 10%. Okay, and then we'll include that chunk in the block. So we'll not end up wasting any space. All right. So this is broadly what this proposal tries to address. Okay. In a cluster mempool world, we'll have transactions arranged in the form of clusters, not in the form of ascendants and descendants. Those clusters will be arranged in the form of transactions that pay the highest fee on top of the cluster and the ones that pay the lowest fee at the bottom of the cluster. The clusters will be further bifurcated into chunks because the block size is finite and it's very little as compared to the mempool. So it's possible that in many scenarios, the entire cluster will not enter the mempool. For that reason, we'll split or we'll slice the cluster into chunks. What if even chunks don't fit for some reason? For that reason, we'll split the chunks into sub chunks and we start trimming the chunks from the bottom of the chunk itself where the lowest fee paying transactions are included. This is what this proposal addresses basically. So we don't waste space because a chunk is bigger than the space that we have available in the block. We don't waste that block space. We trim the chunk from the bottom and we keep trimming it till it is of the size that we can fit it in our block, and that we include that sub chunk in the block and we start mining it. I hope I was able to convey the proposal as a whole. If any questions, anything to share, please go ahead and do so before we move on to the next section.
Yes, that made sense, Faisal. Thank you so much. One question I had was regarding the example given in the newsletter itself. I don't think I follow. So it says that the miner is targeting a block template that is 998 000 virtual bytes and already has 8999001 virtual bytes filled. May encounter 99,000 vbyte chunk. Do you mind walking over the size of the?
Yeah, sure. Let's assume that there's a block, okay, and that block can encompass this much of space for transactions, 100,000 virtual bytes, okay. Now, let's say that some of it is used to store metadata, right? Block header, this, that, Merkle root, ABCD, right? We know what's stored in the block header, and then you have an op return in the Coinbase transaction, okay? So now the miner has this much space to play with, right? 2,000 is gone for metadata. The miner has 998,000, right? Now the miner has already filled this much, 899,001, which is 90% of this.
Which means with other transactions, right? Just to confirm.
Yeah.
That means that, right, okay.
It basically kept on taking chunks. Okay, so the most profitable chunk it took and it put it in the block. Then the next profitable chunk, then the next profitable chunk, then the next profitable chunk, till the miner has filled 90% of its block. Okay, which is 899,001, which is 90% of this. Okay, now the miner has 10% remaining. Okay, and the next chunk that is available to enter the block is this 99,000, which is one virtual byte greater than the space. If you add this 899,001 plus 99000, it will be 998,001 bytes.
Okay.
All right. So the next chunk is so big that it cannot enter the block. It exceeds the space by one virtual byte. So now the miner in an ideal world or in such a situation, what the miner will have to do, the miner will have to just waste this much of space, right? Because the next eligible chunk is bigger than 10%. So the miner will have to only fill its block with 90% of the transactions and leave 10% empty. So the 10% of that space, 10% of that mining fee goes in vain, right? And we don't want to do that, right? So in this situation, what will we do? We'll take this chunk, we'll trim it from the bottom, right? We'll take the transaction which is at the bottom, which is paying the least fee. We'll just trim that transaction. Once that transaction goes, this let's say becomes 98,000. Okay. And now we put that 98,000 here and now the block is full.
Yes. Makes sense. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Anything in the chat box? We'll extend for 10 more minutes if that's okay with y'all. We'll pick and choose. We can't go through the entire newsletter because that'll take a lot of time. Okay, so the releases and release candidate, we'll just read what it is. BDK 1.0.0 beta 1 is a release candidate for the first beta version of BDK wallet with a stable 1.0.0 API. This is a release candidate for the first beta version of BDK wallet. Okay, so a release candidate for beta version of BDK wallet is out with the stable 1.0.0 API, with the stable API. So yeah, whoever wants can go and test it or check it out. We'll pick and choose 2 or 3 from this section. Which one? Let's take this. Bitcoin Core PR 30515 adds the UTXO's block hash and confirmation count as additional fields to the scan_tx outset RPC command response. This provides a more reliable identifier for the UTXO's block than just the block height, especially since chain reorganizations can occur. So there is an RPC in Bitcoin Core scan TX outset. Okay, this RPC, I think the argument that you pass to it is the transaction ID, and the output or the result is that it gives you the block height. Okay, so if you have a transaction ID and you want to know which block that transaction is, you can use this RPC scan TX outset and follow it by the transaction ID, and you will get the block height of that transaction. Okay, initially it used to give the block height. Now it gives block hash and block confirmation count. Okay, so it'll return the block hash, not only the block ID, it will also return the block hash. Okay, the header hash, and also the confirmation, meaning how many blocks have we mined on top of that, 2, 3, 5, 10, etc. So what do you think is the use case of this, or the advantage of this? Okay, what added benefit do we have? Initially, if we had a transaction, we wanted to find out its height. Okay, we could just pass that as a parameter to scan takes outset. It would give us the height. But now along with the height, it's also giving us block hash and confirmation. What do you think could be an incentive for that? Is block height not enough? Any musings? What's the wrong thing that come in your mind? Yeah. Yeah.
During forking, I think the height can't be reliable.
What do you mean by forking? If you could be a bit more.
Temporary fork whenever happens, whenever two different miners propagate the block at the same time, like mine the block at the same time, then two different competing chains happen.
Right. Yeah. The answer is yes. It's for reorg, right? So it's possible that two blocks network at the same time can have the same block height index, right? So if two miners find a block at the same time and both of them broadcast, and half of the network is mining on top of block A and half of the network is mining on top of B. So in the same network we have two blocks which have the same sorry, which have the same block height. All right. So block height can be ambiguous, but block hash cannot be ambiguous. Like two blocks cannot have the same hash. Like there are edge cases. It is possible. Not right now, but historically it was possible. And also confirmation counts. So we have more information now. So even we are explicit and we are very clear about which exact block this transaction is. So even if there are two blocks with the same block height, they not have the same block hash. So that is how we distinguish. So that is an added feature now. So if you pass a TX ID as a parameter to this RPC, along with the block height, it will also give you the block hash and the confirmation count. Okay, and here we have a PR about cluster mempool linearization. Bitcoin PR 30126 introduces a cluster linearization function, linearize, that operates on clusters of related transactions to create or improvise linearizations. As part of the cluster mempool project, cluster linearizations suggest a fee maximizing order in which a cluster's transaction could be added to block templates, or a minimal fee loss order in which they can be evicted from a mempool. These functions are not yet integrated into the mempool, so there's no behavior change in this PR. So like basically a new function has been added which iterates over the transactions in a cluster mempool and arranges them in the form of descending fee rate. That's what this linearize function does. All right, let's take one or two more. Let's take this. Bitcoin Core PR number 30408 replaces the use of the wording public key script to output script to refer to a script pub key in the help text for the following RPC commands: decode PSBT, decode raw transaction, decode script, get block. If verbosity is 3, get raw transaction. If verbosity is 2 or 3, and get TX out. This is the same wording used in the proposed BIP for transaction terminology. So this is, I think, just a change in nomenclature. Recently, we went through an entire PR, I guess, Yeah, we went through an entire PR. So earlier in Bitcoin Core, the version number was recognized by the variable N version. Okay, so like the first piece of information in a block, when you convert a block into when you convert a transaction into its hexadecimal equivalent, the first piece of information that you come across, it's the version number, right? Version number 01, version number 02, version number 03. Okay, so it was referred in Bitcoin Core as N version, the variable N version, and now it's changed to version. So that was a nomenclature change, and this I see as another nomenclature change replaces the use of public key script. So basically, the locking script, something that the common people call as locking script. Okay, it's known as public key script. It's also known as uh, it's known as locking script. It's known as script pub key, and it's known as public key script. Okay, so now it will be known as output script. So this word will be used. So whenever you're using the terminal and you give any of these commands, decode PSBT or decode raw transaction or decode script or get block or get raw transaction. Okay, so instead of referring to it as public key script, it will now refer to it as output script. Right. So it's just nomenclature change, I believe. Let's take which one?
Could the reason, just one thought that I had, could the reason be that because P2PK was the default public key script or the script pub key, that the nomenclature was originally public key script, but now that it could be various form of output script, it's just become a more general term. Just my guess.
Let me see. I don't know exactly the reason, but generally they come up with these nomenclature changes to avoid ambiguity. Let's see what it says. The wording public key script was likely chosen as a human readable form of the technical term script pub key, but it doesn't seem to be really widespread. Replace it by the probably most common term output script. Instead, note that the argument for the decode script obviously is not necessarily an output script. It could be. So I believe the reason is that it is like more normie friendly. It's more human readable. Like if you say output script to somebody, they can understand it more easily as compared to saying public key script. So I
Yeah.
believe the reason is that it is more human readable. Humans can relate with this vocabulary more than this.
Right. Yep.
Okay, let's take one more and then we can open it up for question and answers.
I think
LND,
we
let's
take
try.
Bolt 12 offers because there's a lot of buzz around Bolt 12. If it's okay, we can take that. The next one.
Let's see. Core Lightning 7474 updates the offers plugin to allow for the newly defined experimental ranges for type-length value. Types used in offers, invoice requests, and invoices. This was recently added to the unmerged Bolt 12 pull request in the board's repository. Uh, Updates the offers plugin to allow for the newly defined experimental ranges. So, if I mean, type length value has ranges. It has ranges basically, upper bounds and lower bounds. I don't exactly know what those ranges are. Like we have lots and lots of ranges in Bitcoin as well, right? There is a range to which an element in a tab script can be put. There is a range to it, the block size. There is a range to your mempool. There is a range to the output that you can create. It cannot be more than 21 million. There is a range to candidate block. It cannot be more than 4 virtual megabytes. So like type length value messages, they also specify a lot of ranges for different parameters on the Lightning network, right? So I think they are either trying to expand those ranges or try and experiment with a different range. Like for instance, if I had to speak in context of Bitcoin Core, uh, a very hypothetical example would be the block is one virtual megabyte, and we want to see if we can work with 2 virtual megabytes, right? So we start experimenting with that. We give users the ability to configure and increase the range of a certain parameter to experiment with it. So I think there are certain ranges with regards to the Lightning Network as well, size of an onion message, the size of one layer of onion message ABC, and the size of the messages, in fact, that are exchanged between peers on the network. All right, all of these are governed by this protocol, type length value. So my understanding is that what this PR does is that it allows experimental ranges, meaning it adds new ranges. Either it expands the current existing ranges or it reduces the current extending existing ranges. So that is what this PR does, is that it introduces experimental ranges which are governed by type length value types, and these ranges probably have specific use cases to bolt well, right?
It makes sense.
All right, fine. We'll take one more and then we'll wind it up quickly. LND PR number 8891 adds the new min relay fee rate to the expected response from an external fee estimation API source, allowing the service to specify the minimum relay fee rate. If not specified, the default fee per kilowatt flow of 1012 sats per kVb will be used. The PR also improves startup reliability by returning an error from estimate fee per uh, kW if called before the fee estimator has fully initialized. Uh, so basically, this is an RPC command for LND. All right. Field to the expected response from an external field estimation API source. So if an external API source is querying LND for the min relay field, okay, it will allow that API to specify the minimum relay fee rate, okay. And if no relay fee, meaning if no argument is passed to this parameter min relay field, then it'll stipulate the base minimum fee. Like we have dust fee in Bitcoin, so this is the dust fee for LND. That's 1012 sats per kVb. So that is what it does. It allows external APIs to just stipulate their own specific relay rate, all right? And if there is no argument passed to this parameter, then they'll revert back to this default value. So we will not take anything more because it's already 9:10. I'll stop sharing my screen. And if there are any questions or anything anybody would like to share specific to tonight's session or even other than that, we're okay with it. And now you all can start posting in the chat session how awesome the session was. Gaurav is typing. Why is he typing? Gotta step out. All right. Thanks, man.
It was actually an amazing session because there were a lot of deeply technical concepts. So thank you for making it so engaging and interesting.
Thanks.